for a long, long time, and you read and study and go to Ohio Valley College and you go through the whole Bible and you study, and then when you get to a point where you're studying for a class and you look at John and you've read it over so many times, but then when you look at it differently and try to look deeper and look at what John's trying to do, like the message that he's trying to make sure we know Jesus is the Messiah. That's the point of his book, and so it's interesting, and it's kind of, tonight when we look at this chapter 9, it's interesting that Jesus fixed his battles, I guess would be the correct term. And so when we look at tonight's lesson, he does what he did a few chapters back, and that he heals on the Sabbath day. And there's absolutely nothing sin. Christ did not sin by doing that. He probably violated some traditions, but traditions isn't sinning. And that's how the Pharisees judged a lot, is by traditions more than the law. So we will look at chapter 9. Paul, if you'll read 1 through 7. Chapter 9.
Chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. Now as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. When he said these things, he spat on the ground, made clay with saliva, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with clay. And he said to him, Go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. So he went back and washed and came back seeing.
Okay, so here we have Jesus and his apostles. They see this man. We don't know how old this man is, but obviously he was blind from birth. As we see many times in the Scripture, when someone is in a situation where they are a tax on the society, they kind of are there begging. And that's what this man, he's there, he's blind, he's begging. Now, does he ask Jesus to heal him? Did he say, Jesus, heal me? Did he even know Jesus was there? No. I mean, he's a blind man. And the apostles asked Jesus, whose sin is this? Whose sin caused this man to be blind? Do we have original sin, that babies are born with sin? Stephen?
No, but that concept is very popular in the first century, that if there's something wrong with you because you sinned or your parents.
Now, are there things that happen to people in the result of sin? I mean, if someone goes out drinking and violates the law and has an accident and are lame, or they injure themselves and are... so yeah, I mean, there are some things that sin is the result of. Injury is a result of sin. But in this context, where the apostles are asking Jesus who sinned, whether it was his mom or himself, his parents or himself, that sin. Now it's interesting as we go through this chapter that the Pharisees are really trying to catch Jesus, and as we find as we go through here, that they've basically warned people that if they stand up for Christ and kind of recognize Jesus as the Messiah, then they're going to be cast out of the synagogue. So, and we'll look at that when we see some of the things that happen here. So, was the man healed when Jesus put the clay on his eyes? No. When was he healed? When he by faith, he did what was told to him, and he went and washed, and then he could see. He came back and he could see. Okay? we see in the book of John and other times where Jesus heals many different ways. In this case, he actually spit on the ground, makes clay, puts it on his eyes. Does Jesus have to be in the presence of someone to be healed? No. Where do we have an example of that? The centurion servant, the nobleman's son in John chapter 4, where... I'm sorry? Okay, in Caesarea, he was healed. The nobleman's son was healed. Lazarus was in a tomb. Jesus was outside the tomb. Jesus spoke, and people were healed. In this case, for whatever reason, Jesus spits in and makes clay and puts it on his eyes and tells him what to do, and he goes and does that. Okay, let's look at any other comments about this. Okay. Eric Myers, if you'll read verses 8 through 12.
Neighbors of those that had seen him before as a beggar were saying, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some said, "It is he." Others said, "No, but he is like him." He kept saying, "I am the man." So they said to him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, the man said, "Called Jesus, made mud and anointed my eyes, and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know."
Okay. So obviously this man was blind since birth. They know him as a beggar. He had. What's interesting is as we go through here, now I don't know what kind of education this man had because he's a beggar, but as we look at his conversation with the Pharisees, he sounds like a pretty wise man. And so we'll look at that, but all we know is that from birth he was blind and he was there. Now, when Jesus said that this man, that neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. So can we surmise that this man was blind for Jesus to do this miracle? Is that what Jesus is saying there? Back in verse 4 or verse 3? But that the works of God should be revealed in him? Right. Right. Jesus used... Right. Took advantage of the fact that because he was, and the fact that people knew him. So his neighbors say, but what's interesting is he says, "No, it's me. I'm it. Yes. There's no debate here. That was me. I was the blind man, and I'm healed." And he explains to him how he was healed. Okay, then let's look at 13 through 34. Mark, you want to read that? 13 through 34.
They brought to the Pharisees him that aforetime was blind. And it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Then again the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He said to them, "He put clay upon mine eyes, and I washed, and do see." Therefore said some of the Pharisees, "This man is not of God, because he keepeth not the Sabbath day." Others said, "How can a man that is a sinner do such miracles?" And there was a division among them. They say unto the blind man again, "What sayest thou of him, that he hath opened thine eyes?" He said, "He is a prophet." But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight, until they called the parents of him that had received his sight. And they asked them, saying, "Is this your son, whom ye say was born blind? How then doth he now see?" His parents answered them and said, "We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But by what means he now seeth, we know not, or who hath opened his eyes, we know not. He is of age, ask him, he shall speak for himself." These words spake his parents, because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess that he was Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. Therefore said his parents, "He is of age, ask He answered and said, Whether he be a sinner or no, I know not. One thing I know that, whereas I was blind, now I see. Then said they to him again, What did he to thee? How opened he thine eyes? He answered them, I have told you already, and ye did not hear. Wherefore would ye hear it again? Will ye also be his disciples? Then they reviled him and said, Thou art his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spake unto Moses. As for this fellow, we know not whence he is. The man answered and said to them, Why herein is a marvelous thing, that ye know not from whence he is, and yet he opened mine eyes. Now we know that God heareth not sinners, but if any man be a worshipper of God, doing his will, him he heareth. Since the world began, was it not heard that any man opened the eyes of one that was born blind? If this man were not of God, he could do nothing.
Go ahead, read 34.
But they answered and said to him, Thou wast altogether born in sins, and dost thou teach us? And they cast him out.
Okay, so like I say, this man, he seems pretty wise for a beggar, for a man born blind, and basically was his parents, they called him in, and how does his parents respond? We don't know, and ask him. He's of age. I don't know what of age is, but he's of age. Ask him, because they didn't want to be, they were feared. Obviously, the Pharisees are now at a point where they're trying to, Jesus is getting under their skin. He does these things in public. He does these things that people, multitudes see. And like in this case, we have a man that was blind since birth, and people knew him, and he's healed. There is no blurriness. I mean, he can see. He's healed. He had a requirement to do, and he went and did it, and he could see. I think it's interesting, when they ask him, he says, I already told you. I mean, he seems to have no fear of these Pharisees, of these Jews, because he basically says, you're not listening. I already told you. What is different? Why aren't you listening? And he told him again what happened. We can look at the blind man who he confessed that he was a prophet. We can go back to chapter 4 of John, verse 19, where the Samaritan woman said that Jesus was a prophet. We can go to chapter 6, where he feeds the 5,000. So people thought that he was a prophet because of the actions, his miracles that he performed. They knew he had to be of God. And we go back to Nicodemus in chapter 3. When Nicodemus first talks to him in verse 1 and 2 of chapter 3, he says that you have to be of God to do what you do. So they know that he is of God, but that they don't recognize that. The leaders don't recognize that. Why don't they recognize that? They don't want to. Because they take away their power. It will take away their power. So they don't want to relinquish their power. And it's interesting that this blind man's parents are a little afraid of the Pharisees, but the blind man's not, is he? He doesn't seem to be intimidated by them or taken back by them. I mean, he kind of gives it right back to them. And like I said, it's interesting to me that this man probably had no education, but yet when we listen to what he says here, it's pretty impressive. Any comments or anything about that, about the blind man?
Beginning in verse 27, and he answered them and said, I told you already, why did you not listen? What I got out of this verse was where he said, do you also want to become his disciples? So he got pretty flippant with it.
Yeah, that's what I mean. He has...
He had no regard for the Pharisees, none.
No. And I guess the fact that he was blind, a beggar, and now all of a sudden he's, and as we look...
and his attitude is, what have I got to lose?
Yeah. He gives it right back to him. So,
He did.
And probably, sitting there begging, he probably has heard, he can't see, but he's probably heard so much mistreating of these Pharisees to the common Jews, who were... they were lorded over whenever they can. Again, we talked about the power. They wanted that power. They liked that power. the Sabbath day, the fact that Jesus healed on the Sabbath day, we can look at Jesus never sinned. So that wasn't a violation of the Sabbath. It was a violation of the traditions that they had, and that's their traditions that they try to lord over people because of traditions. So in no way, by healing on the Sabbath, did Christ violate any of the... He didn't sin by doing that. Okay, anything else? They accuse him of being a sinner. Is Christ a sinner? By no means is Christ a sinner. In Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15, if someone read that, Hebrews 4:15. Go ahead, Travis.
For we have not a high priest which cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted, like as we are, yet without sin.
Right. So we have here in Hebrew where it tells us that Christ was tempted like we were, but he never sinned. So he's without sin. So he never violated anything during his life on earth. He never sinned ever at all.
There were even divisions among the Pharisees.
Sure.
They were like, okay, this man's a sinner. But some said that how can a sinner do this miracle? You know, they couldn't deny this miracle. So there was division even among the Pharisees, even though those didn't want to believe in him. They're like, well, we can't deny this,
Right.
this miracle. If he has done it, then he has to be from God.
Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, in those days, someone that was born blind, I mean, they had, and they talk about his eyes open, so I don't know what, he was blind, and but obviously his eyes were open, he could see. I doubt that anyone who was ever born blind, especially at that time, if it wasn't for Christ, would ever be able to see. I mean, there was no medical, they couldn't do that. So the fact that Christ could do that, that showed his power. And it wasn't like someone that they didn't know, because this man they knew. I mean, the disciples, chances are they even knew who this was, because he probably stayed, that's probably where he was all the time, at this spot begging for people. He had no other livelihood.
Even Nicodemus, he came to Jesus. He said, we know, Rabbi, that thou art from God, because no man can do these miracles.
Right. Right, and I know we've talked before about the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin. There were different sects in there, in different groups, and no doubt they all had different belief. Like Nicodemus, like you said, he stands up for Christ, and there are others who believe. Not sure where the verse is, but others believe, but they fear how they would be treated by the Pharisees.
Like the blind man's parents, right there.
Yeah, like the blind. John 12. They fear 42. That so John 12:42. Just turn there. Yeah. Nevertheless, even among the rulers, many believed in him, but because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue, for they love the praise of men more than the praise of God. And that's one of the points in this week's lesson is how many people fear man versus fearing God. I mean, how many of us are afraid to go knock on doors to a neighborhood because we might be rejected or might be made fun of, because we fear man when God is who we should fear. And so, any other comments or points about?
They almost were like that in Acts chapter 4. Peter and John worked that miracle at the gate beautiful. Verses 16 and 17 of chapter 4 says, what shall we do to these men? For indeed a notable miracle has been done of them, and is manifested to all that dwell in Jerusalem. We cannot deny it. But that it spread no further among the people, let us straightway
Right.
And they couldn't deny it. But
No. No.
we need to stop it some way. We need to.
Yeah. And obviously there are, by this point in Jesus' ministry, people knew that he healed. I mean, they followed Jesus for his teaching, but then on the side he also healed. He had compassion on people, and he healed when he, like here, the man didn't even ask. He was just there, and Jesus healed him. Jesus could have just said, get up, take your mat, you can see, but no, he didn't do that. He actually gave him a task to do, and he did it. And people saw what had happened. They witnessed that. They witnessed all these miracles that Jesus did, and like Jimmy said, they knew, but because of what we talked about, how they had power, and they didn't want to relinquish that power, then, they basically crucified Christ. I mean, they put him to death. But the people had to know that Christ was the Son. He was different. He was, like they said, he was a prophet. They know that he was of God. They knew, the Jewish people knew there was a Messiah coming, because that was the message that was over and over. And so now this Messiah is there, and some have accepted it, but others have rejected it. And it was the leaders who rejected it, the Pharisees.
I like the man himself, that he almost calls him out there in verse 30. In fact, the man answered and said to them, this is a marvelous thing that's been done. And, what do you mean you don't know where he's from? That should tell you
Yeah.
right there where he's from.
Yeah.
This is a marvelous thing that is done.
Yeah.
He has opened my eyes.
And what do they do to this man? Kick him out of the synagogue. Yeah. Yeah, he's a troublemaker. Get him out of here. But yes, exactly. I mean, he basically says to him, it's a marvelous thing. I mean, and it is marvelous for him, because he was blind. He had no way of income other than by begging. And like I said, it's whether it's through Christ that this man had this knowledge and confidence to stand up to these men. But I'm impressed by that. I mean, I think that's something that this man was able to take them on, if you will, and put it right back on them. And it's, like he said, I already told you once, you're not listening. And he says, are you disciples? And they're like, no, I'm disciples of Moses. So, okay. Any other comments on that section? I don't know. His parents feared it. Obviously, the people feared it. I don't know. Does anybody else know what was the consequences of being kicked out of the synagogue? What was bad about that? The parents, right? We're talking about the parents who were afraid of it. He wasn't afraid of it.
Worship, it was a place, of course, I don't know if they
Right.
educated children, it was where the children would have been educated. It was, as somebody just said, the social hub of the community.
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously there was it was the place to be as a Jew, as a religious Jew. It was the place to be. Okay. Possibly the marketplace, the employment. Obviously, the Pharisees lorded over it. I don't know. There was we talked last week about where Jesus was, and it was in the treasury part of the synagogue. So I don't know. But obviously, people feared that. And again, the Pharisees, it was something that they lorded over them with that power. Yeah, you said it here. Yeah. Mark used a big word. A social stigma with being cast out. And it was a power that they had. I mean, obviously, people feared that. I mean, that was obviously something that the Pharisees used to their advantage to kind of keep people in check, that they would be kicked out of the synagogue. Okay? Well, I think Bill says that this group had to have a vice grip on these people, and I think they did. I mean, I think they lorded over, they had that power, and that's the only thing that they had, was people wanted to be in the synagogue, wanted to be all the things that go with it, and then they could take that away from them. I think that was probably the one item that they had that they could take away from them. Yes. Right. I mean, last week they wanted to stone him. I mean, they were actually taking up stones to stone him, and he basically hides through the crowd and escapes. Jimmy?
I think it's interesting that they said that they were Moses' disciples.
Yeah.
But Moses actually spoke of Jesus, and Peter repeats that in Acts chapter 3.
Yeah.
That Moses said who there would be another prophet, who would listen to him
Right.
would be,
Yeah.
without so.
Yeah.
But if they were truly Moses' disciples,
They would have known. They would have been looking for. Yeah. And again, we've talked about it. This group, they had power. And then when we jump ahead some 37 years, their power is totally eliminated. They're destroyed. I mean, the Romans have enough of what they're doing. And basically the temple was destroyed. And according to Josephus, 1.1 million Jews are killed. So this group tried to hang on to power. They tried to snuff out the church once it was established, and they were wrong. Definitely wrong. Anything else? Okay, Peter, if you'll read the rest of the 35 to the end of the chapter.
Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you." He said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshipped him. Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, "Are we also blind?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say, 'We see,' your guilt remains."
Okay. So here, Jesus, this blind man is cast out of the synagogue. Jesus finds him. Now, imagine that. Imagine you're this blind gentleman, blind from birth. The Messiah selects you to heal you, and then once you're cast out, he seeks you out and then actually talks with you. And he says, "Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?" And Jesus says, "You have both seen him, and it is him who is talking with you." Can you imagine the power that Christ... Can you imagine being that man? To have Christ say to you, basically, "I am he." And what's he do? He basically says, "Lord, I believe." So, and he worshipped him. Now, we don't know what happens from here if this man becomes a follower of Christ. I'd say that there's a chance that he did, but we don't know. We don't know any of that. But definitely he believed. He confessed him and that he worshipped him. And then the Pharisees, again, they come back and they say, "Are we blind also?" What's Jesus talking about when he says, "For judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, that those who see may be made blind"? What do you think he's referring to there?
Make a contrast to the religious body, such as the Pharisees and those who should have saw Jesus, who he was, but they were blind.
They were blind, yeah.
And then obviously those who, were poor that Jesus reached out to, and they did see.
Yes, several times in John, Jesus refers to being the light. Obviously, John 1 refers to the Word, but in John, it refers to him being the light of the world. And when we have light, we see, and he also talks about those who do evil do it in darkness. And he's contrasting here that those who don't want to see, then they don't see, they're blind. And the Pharisees just don't get it, do they? But yet this man did, and now like I said, we don't know what happens from here. He's cast out of the synagogue. I don't know how they bar him from the synagogue. I don't know if how that happened or how it worked, but I don't think that this man was bothered by that. Anybody else have a comment about that? Yes. I'm sorry? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Jesus is telling who he is, and there will be a judgment, and they will either believe him or not. Here's the blind man who believes him, but the Pharisees still don't. And there will be a judgment, and they will, those who choose not to believe, then they're blinded and there's darkness. And they will be condemned. Anything else in chapter 9? Let's answer some questions then. What did the disciples of Jesus think that caused the blindness of the blind man that Jesus healed?
Sin.
Sin. Whose sin? His or his parents. Were they correct? No, they weren't correct. Name 2 things about the man's blindness or lifestyle that show how challenging his life must have been. He was begging, so he had no source of income. They didn't have the social system that we had, that we take care of others. So basically the only thing he could do was rely on the goodness of other people in begging. Anything else? Yeah. If the disciples thought that, chances are most people thought that somewhere there was sin involved. Tony? So there was that related to it. Yeah. Yeah, and it's kind of interesting that they bring the parents to them to verify that, is this your son? And
They would have been jumping for joy. You would think.
You would think, but they were like...
They threw him under the bus.
They did. He's of age. So I would say that the parents probably had nothing to do with him. I mean, he was a beggar. I mean, he was blind. They couldn't take care of him, apparently, and they just left him to beg and be on his own. And the Pharisees are trying to verify that this man who he is, because his own neighbors were trying to make sure that he was who he is. And he says, I'm he. Yeah, I'm the guy. I mean, he's telling them, yes, that is me. And so, what did Jesus mean when he spoke about the works of God being revealed in the blind man? In verse 3, what did he mean by that? Yeah, it was a miracle.
I think it's interesting, too, that Jesus said, I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. And I don't know, this is kind of my own opinion on that, but I believe that Jesus is referring to that, there's going to be a time when miracles aren't
Right.
going to be around.
Right.
Right now, they are done to show God's word.
Yeah.
There's going to be a time coming when they won't.
Yeah. And that's the same with us. I mean, we have a time to do work, but there's not a time that we shouldn't be working. We don't have a retirement when it comes to Christianity, but for Christ, like John says, it probably had to do with the miracles that were being performed while he was still on the earth in his ministry. He still had time to work, and that's what he did daily. He did, because there would be a time when he couldn't do that any longer. Okay? Jesus said the night is coming. You just talked about that. So Jesus said the night is coming when no one can work. What's the spiritual application of that statement? I think we talked about it with the miracles. Anybody else have a different take on that? At what point was the blind man healed?
When he obeyed what Jesus told him to do.
Right. When he obeyed. Not when the clay was put on his eyes, but when he obeyed. Should we conclude that the healing power was in the water? No. It was the healing power was his faith to just go and do that act that Christ required him to do. The Jewish leaders threatened to put anyone out of the synagogue who confessed Jesus as the Christ. What modern-day situations might be similar to these cases, cases in which people try to pressure someone not to follow our Lord? Does that happen today in our world? What happens, obviously, nobody in this room is in school. I had to make sure we didn't have anybody. But a school-age person, could they go in to their high school and start reading Scripture? Probably not. Probably not. Today, in the society that we live in, depends on your workplace. You possibly can't do that at your workplace. So there are in the world we live in today, there are people who try to snuff out Christianity. I mean, it's there. Yeah. Teaching of evolution is against God. Randy? Yeah. Just the professor doing that on their own. No merit other than the professor because it was on a religious. Yes, good point. Yeah. No, and I mean, the world we live in today, it's definitely, I mean, there are people who are killed today if they don't denounce Christianity in some worlds, in some countries. So, yep. Sure. Yeah. 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 Good point, Mark. Yeah, there are in the society we live in today. There are families that because someone becomes a New Testament Christian, they disavow them and no longer have them part of their family. Yeah. So it's definitely, in the world we live in today, it is something that's present. And, I don't know that we'll ever get away from it. I don't know. I'm not saying that it's to a point of no return, but I think we're at a point of no return. I think when we look at the society that we live in, our education system, and just the general state of the world we live in, it's anti-Christ. And if you stand up for Christ, then you could be ridiculed. And but we know by doing that what our reward is, and we have to remember that.
It's cyclical. For that is, I think, 5 generations probably correct.
Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully it will come back, but I think that.
At some point we will.
Yeah. At some point.
What does the world unfortunately need? They need World War III.
Yeah.
People will look to God. Remember 9/11?
Oh yeah, 9. Good point. Yeah.
It'll happen.
Yeah.
Once there's a desire for it.
Right. Yeah. And Peter said when 9/11 happened, that's when people got back to church for a while. Yeah.
And then they went away.